Alright, so for this, for the next segment of site tectonics or shaping the landscape, we are going into AutoCAD and 3ds Max. So for this section, make sure that you've got yourself an Autodesk login. And once you've got an Autodesk login, you can download AutoCAD and 3ds Max and use it for free for 3 years. I think they give you a student license for. So I've downloaded we're talking about AutoCAD 2021 here. As typical with all programs, we're looking at a bunch of controls under the icon, so new, open, save, import, export. We'll talk a bit more about those. And a bunch of tools that we have along the top here. And then down the bottom here, we've also got a bunch of controls. Okay, so two of our most, well, first of all, let me talk about the units. So if I type in units, you'll see that my unit to scale inserted content is millimeters. So at the moment, I'm working in this drawing in millimeters. I have two important tools here. One is line, one is polyline. The difference between those is that line is a bunch of little segments, so they're all separate pieces. If I type M for move, it's just a separate thing. And if I use a polyline, it's all one piece. There are some really useful tools within polyline. So now if I hover my mouse over the polyline, you can see that I can add vertex or remove this vertex. I can also hover over the rectangular bit through the middle and add a vertex through the middle here. I can even convert, I think from there I can convert to arc, so I can pull that out to there. So there's a bunch of kind of controls that you have access to within that polyline. So there's a bunch more tools. Of course, you can just use the move from here. So M is the shortcut for that. Move, copy, stretch, a bunch of different things. The one I'd like to show you, I guess, next is the offset tool. So if we take that, and it'll ask me through erase or layer. I've already done this before, so it's about to offset 2000, which is 2000 millimeters. So it's about to offset this thing by 2 meters. So I can just say yes, 2000 is good. And I can offset. I can select it and offset in the direction that I want to go in. So that is the line, polyline, and offset command. The other thing I just wanted to talk about in this very first video is the fact that if I type in PL for polyline, enter, and I drag my mouse out in a direction that I want to go in, and then let's say I type in 14,000 for 14 meters, it will give me a line segment that is exactly 14 meters long. I can measure that with the measure command, so it's exactly 14 meters long, which is fantastic. The other thing I'm not particularly fond of when I'm doing a polyline is you can see that it's trying to kind of dimension things for me at the side. I find that a bit messy working that way. So I usually come down here to the object snap, and I come to my little arrow beside here, and I go to my object snap settings. And in here I turn off my dynamic input, enable dimension input where possible. I just turn that off because it's a little bit annoying. So now when I type PL, I'm getting little bits and pieces, but I'm only getting the polar snap trackings for 90 degrees. So that is kind of useful sometimes. So you can turn that on and off using this one here. So tracking settings, you can come to your polar tracking, and that gives you the incremental angle. I would just turn that off most of the time. We don't need it for this, but for some things you'd need it, for other things you wouldn't. The other thing I want to talk about with the snaps is that you can see that when I type in PL or use my PL command, you can see there's a square turning up that says endpoint. So if I was to draw a line from this point, that line is infinitely on the endpoint of that line. There's no little gap. I could zoom in forever and they would definitely be on top of one another. Under the snaps have a lot of controls. There's also, midpoint, center, yada yada yada. Intersection, extension is really useful. Perpendicular is useful sometimes and useful not. Nearest is a sort of a dark art, and parallel is often very useful. So you tend to kind of need these in a variation of, you need them variably. So let's say I had a line that was crossing this line and a line that was happening at the intersection of this line. But let's say this line was just a little bit off from here. I'm just going to make it a bit closer. So what I'm going to do now is hold down Shift, right click, and I can now select what type of snap I want. So let's say I want a nearest, but I don't want it to be the intersection of those 2 points. Now that is infinitely touching that line because I selected nearest, but it is of course not on the intersection of that line. Alright, so looking at that from this scale, you might think that all of that intersection and this line are all close enough to each other. So let's say I wanted another polyline, and I actually want this polyline to be at the intersection and not the end point. You can see that there's an amount of tension between where that can go. So you've got to be really careful to make sure that you're using the right snap. So if in this case I want the endpoint, I need to wait till I see the square. However, if I want the intersection, I need to wait to see the green cross, which is specifying that my line is going to be infinitely at that intersection. So the snaps are super, super powerful and really useful for making things work properly.